everyone. Thanks for coming in the rain and the bad weather. We are recording tonight a couple different ways. We're hoping that we're successful with the recording. We're also doing an audio recording. We should have information so that those people who aren't here or want to hear it again will be able to do that through the website. I want to introduce Caleb Brassico. I guess I introduced Ms. Kelly. Last presentation, I apologize for that, only to find out that his grandfather used to call him that, so it wasn't that fortuitous, it was just that lucky. At any rate, tonight's meeting is going to be a furtherance of this process of determining what our preferences are. He's got a great presentation for you, I think you'll enjoy it, and I'm going to hand it off to him.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Caleb Brassico. I may not be able to speak very loudly because I have had a cold, so this is my first couple of hours out in the past week. I want to also introduce Doug Young to make a few remarks.
Hey there, everybody. Good evening. My name is Doug Young with the City of Atlanta's Planning Department, and I'm managing the city's historic preservation programs, as probably heard me say many a time since we've been here. We're excited about the additional information that Caleb's going to be talking about tonight, and sort of more and more refining to the direction of the proposal for a historic district. We'll be adding some comments along the way. Caleb will do most of the talking tonight, and then I believe we're going to have some Q&A at the end, and I'll be a part of that as well. But thanks for coming out. It's really important to the city and our department that folks are participating in the process, and we appreciate the efforts to make that happen. So thanks for coming out.
Thank you, Doug. So this evening, as was mentioned, our goal is to sort of further refine, talk about some of the recommendations that came out at the previous meeting, and then very importantly, let you know about opportunities to provide further input into the process. As Jerry mentioned, this is being recorded, so I ask you to hold off any questions until the end when we do have a Q&A period so that the folks who are not here can follow along. So again, our goal for this evening is to review the changes from the previous draft and talk about some additional potential recommendations that have been put forth based on your feedback. Additionally, that includes refining some previous recommendations based on what you told us, and then sort of talking about the relationship to some new concepts. So as a reminder, these recommendations have been put together by my firm, TSW. They do not reflect the opinion of the City of Atlanta nor Ponce Highland Neighborhood Association. I'm really trying to act as a third-party, impartial sort of facilitator to the process. But we have been guided by a couple of things. The first thing is, as you know, at the beginning of the process, many, many months ago, there was a working group who sort of laid some of the groundwork for the conversation. There were many, many meeting comments that we have received in the course of the process, really all the way from day one to last week. And then most significantly, there have been a lot of supplemental online surveys that we have downloaded and reviewed to sort of get us to where we are today. In fact, as of about an hour and a half ago, we had 350 responses to the survey from the last meeting, and about 170 of those are unique individuals. You may remember that the survey was in such a way that you could respond for different sub-areas. So if a person responded about sub-area 1, 2, 3, and 4, those are 4 responses, but 1 individual. And then finally, there is a whole series of city policy and zoning law and professional best practices that have led us to where we are this evening. So generally speaking, we have gotten a lot of additional feedback based on what you told us. We've made a lot of progress in sort of honing ideas and coming up with recommended solutions. And I would say we're at about 95% clarity on most of the items. The 5% being the potential items for consideration that we'll discuss this evening. Now, because of that, most of what I said before has not changed. There's been no change in terms of having an ordinance that is much clearer than typical ordinances, that uses graphics and uses this idea of form-based coding, really thinking about regulating more through building type and building form than just the use of the property. Now, one of the big areas where there has been change is this idea of setbacks. And what you're seeing before you is actually an excerpt from the draft code, which has been submitted to the neighborhood today for review and discussion, and I'll talk a little more about that at the end. But the particular setback here, the particular comment here related to a previous observation I had about tying house and structure setbacks to the compatibility rule. it was pointed out by a couple of homeowners in the course of the surveys that there are conditions where homes are literally 3 to 6 inches from the property line. And so because of that, there really is, from a fire code perspective, a reason to have a more gracious setback, in addition to things like tree ordinances and stormwater ordinances. So I wanted to amend one of my previous recommendations and say that the compatibility rule in the residential areas for setbacks of additions would still apply, but there really should be a minimum of 3 feet so that you don't have a person who happens to have a 6-inch setback extend that all the way to the back. So that is a change that was different than what we talked about previously. But by far, most of the changes we're going to talk about tonight get to this idea of what areas of the neighborhood are we regulating. And I say the neighborhood, I really mean sub-areas 1, sub-area 2, and sub-area 6. These are the portions of the neighborhood today that are either zoned R4 or R5. So they're primarily the residential core. They're not, for the most part, Orland Avenue or Ponce de Leon Avenue or adjacent to the Beltline. They're really the residential. Now, as you may recall before, we talked about how many historic districts regulate based on what is visible from the street. And there were a lot of questions about what does that mean? Does that mean the whole side of the property? Does that mean only the first 10 feet? Does that mean 20 feet? What does that mean? And so there was a lot of requests to come up with something that might be a bit clearer. So one of the ideas that I had that I wanted to put forth for consideration was to actually define a portion of a lot numerically, meaning a certain number of feet or a certain percentage of the lot, an area that I'm calling the lot compatibility zone, only for the purpose of discussion. So the idea here is that this tool, this zone of the residential property, would be the portion of the residential property where the bulk of these new historic type regulations apply. What you see from the street, what defines the character. So in this area, as I mentioned, this is really envisioned as the front of the property. The area where a bulk of the principal structure is, the area where the porches tend to be, the areas where the landscaping tend to be, the areas where when you walk and you drive down the street, really begin to establish the character of Ponce Highland. It would, again, allow greater flexibility in the rear, but we would have this frontal zone that is going to be subject to new, more types of regulations, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, as we think about that, it's been really challenging to think about what is a correct number. And I went through a bunch of scenarios in my office with the geographic information systems, and I found out a couple of things that are really interesting. First of all, when you look at Ponce Highland, most of the residential lots are between 125 and 200 feet. You have some that are shallower, adjacent to Freedom Park, but most of them are in that range. Additionally, the corner lots tend to be deeper, tend to be wider, I should say. So while the average single-family lot is 50 feet, corner lots, for the most part, are between 50 and 60. So no single number, yet different patterns, but again, getting to an idea. So based on that, we also looked at sort of the physical experience when you go down various streets. I had an opportunity to walk some of the streets, and I looked in Google Earth at some of the streets, and really tried to get a sense of what defines what you feel when you feel Ponce Highland, when you talk about preserving the character and not allowing the whole neighborhood to become a bunch of 3-story white boxes. And so based on that, my recommendation is to really think about approximately the first 60 feet in depth of the lots. But because we do have some shallower lots, having an exception there for lots that are shallower. Basically, it would say 60 feet or never more than 50% of the lot. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. So that was my recommendation for what I believe reflects the character of the neighborhood as most people experience it. Is it the right number? It may not be. You may disagree. You may think I'm being too conservative. I'm not being conservative enough. And then the other question that we're going to have to think about is, how do we address the sides of properties? So right now, I'm only focusing on the front. So if we took that number, 60 feet, we then went in GIS, and we actually applied it to all of the residential lots in the residential suburbs. Showed it in orange, and as you can see, for the most part, but not always, a 60-foot setback or 60-foot zone generally picks up about 1/2 to 2/3 of the structure. It generally picks up all of the front yards, and it doesn't go generally more than 1/3 into the lot. When you think about what that actually looks like from the street, here's an example. This is Seminole. The 60 feet lot compatibility zone, if we did that, is shown at the front here. This could be the area that is held to a higher standard of preservation. And again, I'll talk about what those could be in the future. With much more flexibility at the back, subject to the fact that this is a corner, so we might need to think about doing something on the corner. Now, mid-block, here's another example, also on Seminole. You can see, again, the 60 feet gets the front of the traditional structure, it gets the yard, but going back a certain distance, when you enter the yellow, it really would be out of it. Here's another on Linwood. These houses are a bit further back, so the 60 feet comes more into, it doesn't go as far into the building as others, but again, that front, that part you experience as historic or potentially historic is shown. Blue Ridge, here's another. And then of course, Somerset, another, again, just showing how far they go. And then finally, we even looked at Belgrade. Belgrade, you can see here, all sorts of varying setbacks, but the front is preserved. So regardless of what that ends up being, regardless of how we end up defining that area, the idea is that there seems to be a consensus among the residents that there should be different standards for the front of the lot or the part of the lot on the street, and more flexibility for the rear of the lot. And so what that zone is trying to define is where do we draw that? Because it really does have to be a number. It has to be something that Doug Young and his office, if this district is adopted, can look at the plan, can measure, and can be black or white. It's there or it's not there. So what are the kind of things that could be regulated in that zone? Okay, and these are some of the things we talked about before. Well, one of those could be standards for alterations and additions to existing historic buildings. Again, these are buildings that have been shown as gray on the inventory map, meaning they're a contributing historic structure. It could also be particular new standards for alterations and additions to non-historic buildings. And then, of course, finally, any new construction. If a house burned down or if there was a vacant lot, although I really don't think there are many vacant lots in the residential core. And then again, our recommendation is that based on the feedback, outside of that zone, whatever that ends up being, there's much more flexibility at the root. So in terms of how do we actually address these three things at the top, I had the pleasure of reading through 350 comments on this issue and having to put forth a recommendation that I hope begins to be a semblance of something that can get neighborhood support. So the first set of recommendations relates to alterations and additions to the existing historic buildings. Again, the contributing historic structures. We would like to recommend, based on your feedback, that any alterations to those or additions must be compatible with the style of the historic building in that frontal zone. So for example, the bottom is sort of a craftsman, although not a pure craftsman home. Any additions in the front would have to be in that character, which means any dormers would generally have a sloping roof. The brackets would have to be exposed. The material would have to be exposed. You could not, under this scenario, take the front of that house, build a sort of Mies van der Rohe pyramid, and put it on the front. That would be a very clear example of what would not be allowed. Conversely, you couldn't take that house and build a big Gothic second-story addition because that doesn't exist in the neighborhood. Now, on the issue of second-story additions, there seems to be a consensus that everyone or the majority of the folks want to allow people to add second stories to the front of the houses. It was about 65, 70%, depending on which sub-area you looked at. Interestingly enough, Bonaventure Somerset does allow that. And so we would recommend allowing those second-story additions on the front, similar to Bonsam, if it was in keeping with the character of the home, the style of the home on the frontal portion, and as also in Bonsam, if it preserved an indication of the original roof eaves. And I'll show you in a moment what that means and what that doesn't mean. Additionally, a lot of you very strong support with this idea of allowing window replacement. And I have confirmed with Doug Young that window replacement would mean that the new windows would have to be similar in character, but they could be newer materials, they could be metal, they could be other I don't want to say more energy efficient because the old windows can be made energy efficient, but they could be modern materials. The same with painting of masonry, which is recommended for permission under this district, provided there's masonry paint using, and then siding replacement, also subject to the modern materials and compatibility. Now, there were quite a few comments about the removal of chimneys, and chimneys are generally seen as a character-defining feature. So at this point, professionally, I can't recommend allowing that. Now, again, if you all disagree with me, this is your neighborhood, this is your project, but that is such an important piece of the front of the buildings. Now, Doug, are there financial considerations that the city looks at if someone has a structurally unstable chimney and can't afford to repair it? Because several folks asked that in the survey.
The City of Atlanta's historic and landmark districts all include what's called a financial hardship provision. To give a sense of the context, we've had that provision for a couple decades now, and it's been used probably in less than a dozen times related to requirements, mostly because when that issue that does arise, we often can find a solution to both the programmatical and the architectural goal at the same time. And it's also usually applied to other aspects of construction, so really come up in a chimney conversation. The most common chimney thing we have come up in our other districts is that people who are not actually following the permit process remove the chimneys, or they take the inside the roof out. And they go, oh, I can't leave it up on the roof anymore, so they take the outside chimney off as well, which makes sense if you've got it inside the house and not done it the right way. So that's something we would definitely want to talk about. We think the city staff thinks that chimneys are a pretty important character-defining feature of a home. So in most of our districts today, they will be removed from the uniform.
And then as Doug mentioned, there is an opportunity to sort of prioritize materials and think about, again, greater emphasis on that preservation in the front, and then of course, different ways to handle replacement as well.
Can I just go back to that prior slide? You've spoken about the front a lot, but I don't see the wording a lot of the front of the house. So just 100%, everything you're talking about on the slide is referring to the front of the house, even though it doesn't state that.
Yes, the presentation is a conversation. The first part of the conversation was saying we could define a lot compatibility zone with these three things in it. And then within that lot compatibility zone, these are what could theoretically happen within those.
In the front of the house.
The lot compatibility zone, which is
I don't know what that means.
analogous to the front, but did you just arrive? For the sake of folks at home, I want to continue the presentation and I'll explain that later. So these would be examples of what might be, what we might be talking about. Again, the real challenge in finding images is that every building is unique, every context is unique, so it's really hard to find something perfect. So none of these perfectly reflect what I'm talking about, but they represent ideas. So here's an example of a second-story addition that is compatible with the historic building below in terms of materials, roof shape, style, etc. Now there are a couple of things here that I actually would not recommend. One is that there is no eave. You can't see on the side where the original roof line used to be. And Bonaventure Somerset actually requires that sort of indication to be preserved as part of being able to see where the original structure was. And then additionally, this is really far to the front, and so when you look at most historic districts anywhere in the country that allow second-story addition, they do require them to be pushed back probably a bit further than this. And in Bonsam, it requires it to be 10 feet behind the porch. But this is just showing sort of the style compatibility. Here's another example from Grant Park where an attic build-out is occurring in the front. Again, this is an attic space where they're adding habitable floor area. There is a dormer that's been added, and it's compatible with the historic structure below in terms of material, shape, and style. Here's an example of what would probably not be permitted. So this is also a second-story addition. This addition is not compatible in terms of window shape. The ones at the bottom are all vertical and ganged. At the top, you have sort of this picture window and then weird scenarios. Materials, the bottom is historically masonry. The top is, may even be metal in this case. The original roof line of the porch that used to be there is completely obliterated. You can't see it. A lot of the details have removed. And really, the historic home is obscured. So those are the kind of things that we could either allow or prohibit in the front. I am recommending to prohibit this and allow some more flexibility in the front within that potential lot compatibility zone as these go. Now, the second thing you could regulate in the lot compatibility zone is how do we handle existing non-historic buildings? And we have a couple of these that have been so adulterated in the neighborhood or are relatively new. So there are really two ways to look at this. The first way is to say that whatever additions or modifications occur to those houses, and it would be similar to everything I just talked about, adding a second floor, enclosing a porch with glass, changing out windows, that they would all have to be compatible with the style of that house. So if that house was, I use a ranch, even though I know we don't have any ranches, and ranches are not the kind of historic resource protected in Ponce Highland, there would at least be a mechanism for ensuring compatibility with that style. You could also look at allowing them to look at other historic forms in the area, or you could also allow contemporary additions to non-contributing historic structures. So that idea I had of allowing for something more modern at the front, perhaps a flat roof, or even the proverbial IMK pyramid, that would be more appropriate or could be more appropriate there. Now then, in terms of new construction, new houses, again, which we don't really have many opportunities for, I would recommend incorporating the language in Bonaventure Somerset that really gives two options. The first option is to look at the historic homes in the block face and really mimic them in terms of materials and style, etc. The other option would be to allow the contemporary, which Bonsam actually does as well. So the first option that I mentioned would, again, result in something that's very similar in look to the houses around it. This happens to be in West End, but this is on a particular street where every home is sort of a folk Victorian New South Cottage or Queen Anne cottage, so very compatible in many ways. The contemporary option could allow something like this. Again, Bonaventure Somerset allows contemporary design. It may not allow this particular specific house, but I wanted to express the idea. This home would not have to resemble the block face, would have a lot more design flexibility. Now, there is, in fact, what I would consider another option for contemporary. And it's what I personally call more contextual modern or contextual contemporary. There are ways, and there are historic districts that allow for very contemporary new construction, but it has to be in the material vocabulary of the block. So if every house on the block is brick, the code could be written in such a way that any new houses, even if they're contemporary, have to be brick. Or if every house is siding or clapboard, then this new home could be siding. This happens to be in a development that we worked on. It's an extremely contemporary home, but it does draw on the materials and the porch patterns and the other patterns of the historic neighborhood. So a question we're going to ask you in the follow-up survey is, if we're going to allow contemporary houses, should they have to have compatible materials in that frontal zone? Now, with all of that said, everything I've talked about to the woman's comment earlier would apply to the lot compatibility zone. Nothing is intended to, as I presented, to prohibit contemporary rear additions. And these are some photos that Mr. Bunn was kind enough to share with us, where you have a Tudor Revival home with an extremely modern addition in the rear. So assuming that addition was in the back, not in the lot compatibility zone, that could be allowed under these regulations.
It's in the front too.
It is in the front? Okay.
That porch addition is contemporary.
See, I need new glasses. There we
It's all
go.
done the world on this line. It is a style.
So in a couple of days, once Amir and I finalize it, you'll be getting a survey that asks for a lot of detail on some of these ideas. Now, there are also a couple of other ideas that came out of the meeting that I wanted to run past you. The first one regards also sub-areas 1, 2, and 6, which again, to remind you, are the residential core, Bonaventure, Somerset, and then portions of Belgrade Avenue. Now, I mentioned that we looked very carefully at the surveys, and what I'm about to tell you really shocks me, believe it or not. There is very strong support in Ponce Highland for allowing people to put multifamily units in existing houses. It was between 60 and 70% depending on sub-area. The idea being obviously that there are benefits to that in terms of keeping housing affordable and expanding housing options. So based on that survey, I am recommending keeping a couple of our previous recommended use provisions, which would be one, that we allow existing non-conforming multifamily buildings, the missing middle, to remain, and that we do not allow commercial uses. This is an area where, again, many of the folks who responded to the survey did indicate support for rezoning all of the residential areas to commercial, for allowing commercial uses in the housing. That's something that would really fly in the face of 40, 50 years of City of Atlanta policy. So I'm not saying it's off the table, but I think there are a lot of very possible negative repercussions to that, if we allowed every home to have a true business in it, a coffee shop or something like that. So if you disagree with me, by all means let me know, but you do have commercial areas within a very short walk of all the residential. Now, back to the multifamily though. So based on that, I'm recommending something that I don't think has been done anywhere in the City of Atlanta. Again, assuming that there is a desire to have more than one single family house in a property. I'm recommending that we think about allowing up to 3 dwelling units on lots of record. And what is a lot of record? It means it is a historic lot that shows up on a really old map that they have down at City Hall, a hand-drawn map. Is that a good explanation? There's a map at City Hall that you can get online that shows every historic lot of record. So what that means is that if you have one of these, you can't subdivide it to get around the rules. You have to work within it. So within those lots of record, if you allow 3 dwelling units, it could take a lot of different forms. It could be a single-family dwelling. It could be a attached ADU, an attached sort of in-law suite, and a detached in-law suite. That would add up to 3. Or it could be a duplex and 1 attached or detached ADU. Or it could be a single triplex in an existing building, or it could be 1 single-family home and 1 duplex. Again, keeping in mind that all of this would not impede any of the preservation goals that we talked about. So this is a very new concept for Atlanta. It actually, in some ways, harkens back to the 1929 zoning code, which used to define a single-family dwelling as actually housing for 2 families. But we took that away. But this would actually be an intriguing change if it's something the neighborhood truly supports. So I really want to get some feedback on that. And so the other area I wanted to focus about was this idea of resource protection and compatible new development in the more commercial areas. In sub-areas 3, which is Highland Avenue, 4, which is Ponce, and 5, which is Bellevue. So in this area, we are recommending that alterations to buildings must be compatible with their style, which means in the case of Highland Road, right? What is compatibility with the style? It means, well, if the windows had to be removed or if the doors had to be removed, you'd put something back that kind of looks like a 1900 to 1920 commercial building. Also, would recommend, again, allowing painting of masonry and allowing replacement of damaged windows. But with that said, based on the feedback provided, I actually recommending that additions to these buildings should be allowed to be compatible or contemporary, regardless of where they are, right? These are commercial properties. A lot of you indicated in your survey that you've gone to Europe where you've seen this really neat little pristine preserved farmhouse with a very contemporary hotel around it. You know, that would all be allowed under this scenario. But, as mentioned before, if that addition occurred on top of the preserved resource, we would recommend a minimum 10-foot setback. Again, these were the photos that I took a couple of years ago in Seattle, where there's a very similar rule in place. The historic resource at the bottom is generally protected in keeping with the character. The stuff above is contemporary, but don't focus on the style. Can we do it at the end? Sorry, please. We're almost done. So in terms of new construction, the recommendation is also very similar to that. Allow non-historic buildings and new construction to have more flexibility, to be contemporary or to be compatible with their style, but not allow beyond that. Now, there is an area here where I intentionally also want to get some more feedback, and that relates to whether or not this is really what the neighborhood would like to see in all the commercial areas. So, for example, North Highland Avenue, where one could very easily argue that there are some pretty strong patterns. All the buildings are masonry today, and they all do have a certain window form, and they all do have sort of other design features. We could sort of tighten that in those areas, but I'm not sure that's where the neighborhood wants to go, so I proposed a very general idea. The other area would actually be along the Beltline. Several of you in your survey comments talked about, well, new buildings there should be industrial, right? And I know Doug would love to enforce that, to interpret that. But there are things that if the neighborhood wants a bit more regulation along the Beltline, we could codify standards for things that are often seen as industrial. For example, larger window areas, prohibiting certain materials, that kind of thing. And then finally, with that said, there are two other things that I wanted to put forth that I had not mentioned in my previous presentations. The first one is that, particularly for the commercial property, the signs are really important to some of them. We know the Claremont signs, even though it's not in the district. We know the Barclay Plaza signage. So I wanted to remind everyone that signage, in fact, can be part of the historic resource. And then finally, would like to, and Doug is not aware of this, I'm curious what he'll think. Do believe that the neighborhood should think about some prohibitions against LED rope lighting. You don't have a lot of it, but it is one of those things that we've seen in other communities where tenants can come in and it really drastically changes the character of the commercial district. So for your consideration, as all of this is for your consideration. So with that said, we are also under a timeline. So I had to pull together this presentation and begin to put together a draft code in such a format that it can be easily modified based on the feedback that we get from you. And the reason for that is actually structuring the code takes a really long time, and you can't do it in a couple of hours. So I have actually written a draft ordinance, which will be shared with everyone. But I want to remind you all, again, that draft means draft. Every single thing in there is up for modification or discussion, and that is actually noted at the bottom of every single page. Additionally, as you review it, there are actually some of my personal notes for you and others in there. As you're going through the code, if you see text in red boxes, that is a note. That is a note that says we need further dialogue on this, really on what we've talked about this evening, or other clarification. So when you look at the code, it's pretty long. It's about 50 pages, but it does do a lot of the things that we've talked about sort of at the entire course of the process. It sort of lays out what the minimum statutory requirements are. It talks about permitted uses, and I put in all the customized uses that we've talked about, hopefully in a table that is much clearer to understand than anything you've seen in other districts in the city. It uses form, so there's about 10 pages where it has those form-based standards, which again are not about style, they're not about architecture, but they are about things like percentage of window openings, and where parking can go, and where doors can go. And all of the things that the city already regulates in the Beltline overlay and in the quality of life districts, but reformatted so that they're not in 45 different sections of the code, they're in one area. And so we expect that that will be something that is updated. We know that that is something that will be updated going forward. Now with that said, several of you had questions, so I would love to answer your questions before I talk about next steps. I think, sir, you had your hand up first?
Sure. So one question, you mentioned sort of a different set of regulations for contributing historic districts, and I was curious how that would affect contributing historic properties that have existing non-standard features to them. And just to use a very specific example, I have a closed-in porch already, which I'm assuming might be something that would be regulated. So.
Yeah, it's a great question. It comes up quite a bit in our conversations. Couple things I'll say that. One is we start from where we are, so you wouldn't have to be removing anything that otherwise you like or want to keep or whatever.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we can sort of figure out a way to describe is, and this came up in Montgomery Summers as well, so if there's things that would, if you will, sort of non-historic features on a property that for some reason the property is partially destroyed or somehow there's some sort of mishap, you want to put it back the way it was before, even though that might not meet the current requirements, or if in fact they get adopted, then there's a provision we included in that district that said you can sort of put it back the way it was, or you can make it conform to whatever the requirements are, but you can't sort of mix and match, I guess. And that was actually specifically related to porches, if I'm not mistaken, in that conversation. And that also is a new tool we added to that district, which is to allow the sort of a reestablishment of that unusual pattern, for example, to sort of paraphrase it.
And then, sir, you were next.
Right here.
I had, you said that every page is going to be subject to change, so I like that statement that you made. I guess I have a general question about the sub-areas, and I noticed that, you know, on your map thing here that you have, there's certain areas in our neighborhood that have been excluded, like the Plaza area. You're not including that in this historic district. And I mean, you did include the Ford factory, or you know, but not the Plaza area. And then there were parts of Freedom Park that have been excluded, and that sort of concerns me.
Yeah, the plaza is already a landmark building?
Landmark district.
Landmark district, so it already is a historic district?
So is Bonson,
Correct.
that is included.
Yes, ma'am.
The Bonner Somerset district does not have both underlying and overlay zones, and so the Bonner Somerset goes on top of what's the R4 in that area. One of the things that we've also got feedback on are the folks in Bonner Somerset that don't want anything to change in their requirements.
Sure, I mean, why should we?
That's
I didn't feedback.
Now, to Freedom Park, you had actually asked me that at the last meeting. What this does is it only changes what is currently SPI 6. So SPI 6 is the Freedom Park zoning district, and the portions of Ponce Highland that are not zoned in the Freedom Park SPI are not modified. So this would get rid of SPI 6 and incorporate that into the new sub-area 7. But it doesn't go all the way down to the Carter Center, which is all zoned as, it's actually Carter Center is zoned residential, RG4. I'm not sure of the history there, but it picks up what is only the SPI today.
I have a map of the old zoning here too, and it shows the Carter Center, you know, zone RG1, and other areas like the area that, well, it sort of concerns me that we're excluding those areas, because what would be the impact that could happen to the rest of our historic district if something were to be developed in those areas in the future?
Yes, so here's the neighborhood, right? Literally, the only area being excluded is Briarcliff, and then all this, which is Freedom Parkway Carter Center. The whole rest of the neighborhood is in it.
But there's parkland up to Freedom Park, so that's not Carter Center. There's parkland up.
Yeah, but that is not zoned SPI7.
So who cares?
Yes,
It's part of
yes.
our neighborhood. It's within our neighborhood
It's
boundaries.
a minor change, and if
Can we not do that? I mean, because in years.
I don't believe we can legally expand the historic district beyond what was in the introductory
In this
legislation
round of this public process, but it could be added to.
in the
But you
future.
said we could make changes to the boundary. You asked
Well,
that
we also have
question
to
for
follow
every sub-area.
Follow the law.
The sub-area boundary changes can be made, we can't legally change someone to be included in the historic district and have a notice, provided a notice from the beginning.
Who's them?
The people who own that property.
Who owns it? The city, right?
No,
Or
DOT
the
owns
DOT?
it. DOT owns it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense.
Sub-area 7.
Correct.
And sub-area 7, from the last conversation, the city could lease it or sell it. But we're gonna try to exclude that.
Yes, when you look at the sub-area 7 text, the use chart, you'll notice that there are no permitted uses allowed there other than public uses, gardens. And you legally, and this is all subject to the law department to review. And I'm going to absolutely admit that this is about the state law. This is not about anything the city can do. So if the state doesn't allow that, we have to follow the state law. That's what the city attorney will be looking at.
So SPI 6 were the areas that confronted or were adjacent to sub-area 7, if I remember
So
correctly.
what is currently sub-area 6, I mean SPI 6, all those areas have been included in what is now sub-area 7 in the new zoning category. What is not included is the RG property that was not ever in SPI 6 before. It's not in SPI 6 now.
Well, that property where Erica Heller lives, which is right above that 7 on the south side, that was part of SPI 6
Yeah.
originally.
So some of the residential
And now it's
properties
being
that were
overlooked.
developed are included in the adjacent residential areas.
Okay, great.
Yes, sir?
Yeah, I want to find out if it's something that's recently been built, cross pumps, would be allowed under this, down where it used to be a traditional multifamily Spanish style, open community, and now they tore it down and built this long thing.
Correct.
It's totally incompatible.
That would not be allowed, and that would not be allowed under several reasons. The first reason is if that had been a district, the structure could not have been demolished. Now, if the property had been vacant, the form-based standards actually do not allow that. When you pick up the code, when you get the code, go to building types. And townhouses, which is what those are defined as a building type. But it says that when a townhome has a side that faces the street, that side must be treated as a front compatible with the adjacent houses. So they would have to have had a porch, windows, all of this. So when you look at that, the important thing under the building form standards is that all the regulations use the word street facing. And street facing is because of stuff like that.
The other thing I would add, just right quick to follow up on that, and I believe this was a question in either the last survey or the survey before this, was on, for example, the Ponce Leon corridors, which is survey 4 in this proposal, what is the interest in having, apart from those sort of street orientation standards of having potentially contemporary new construction on Ponce, filling in what doesn't have anything now? And I believe that was a question when sort of, I don't
Yeah.
remember the
And
response
most
to
of the
that.
folks seemed supportive of contemporary with some material restrictions.
Okay.
You ma'am, and then you like this.
So going back to the multifamily, I understand, whatever's multifamily now can continue to be multifamily, but what you're saying, if I understood it correctly, is a new if someone's going to redevelop, they can turn it into a 3-dwelling unit?
No, actually, what this would do, again, in the red, if there is a single-family house, they could turn it into a triplex. That's what this,
And
that's why, again, this one really surprised me, so I'm not sure people understood it.
Right.
Or if they did understand it, there was more nuance that they wanted to give.
What is more common in a historic district? What's a more common rule related to multifamily?
In our current historic district we have around the city of Atlanta that are neighborhoods versus sort of commercial historic districts, they typically stick with the use following the form. So if you have a house, you can have one unit in it. If they have an apartment building or flat, you can have whatever is otherwise allowed by that zoning category. So that's, Kevin pointed out, this would be a new concept for neighborhood.
But to
But-
be clear, it would still look like a.
It would have to look like a house.
Yeah, but
So the outside would
it
be.
still has potentially the same concerns that you would have regardless.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a big issue. I mean, this is,
Yeah,
this one,
and it's
I've seen
new.
a lot. This really surprised me.
Yeah.
So,
How was the question asked on the survey?
there was if I recall correctly, there was this thing that said that the district can include adding additional uses in the residential type. And then it said multifamily housing in existing buildings and new construction, which is what these indicate. I know this is hard to see, but there were a variety of uses, sub-area 1, 2, and 6. The green.
That's listed vertically as the different.
The green was new construction, or actually the green was existing building, the blue was new construction. And so again, these are all on a scale to nearly 100. So of the 350 responses, there was a lot of interest in this. So I don't know if people didn't understand it, which is why we're having this conversation. You are next, ma'am, and then you, and then we'll go this one.
Just to respond, I actually really applaud that, because I think that's a very forward-thinking, given the amount of growth that the city is projected to see, and a way of trying to provide some affordable options in the neighborhood. But my original question was to ask, the way that you presented the residential and the mixed use, you kind of grouped them together as far as the sub-areas with your recommendations. Would there be, are you recommending nuance between those 3 different residential districts so that
Yes.
residential core is seen differently than where Belgrade is?
Look at
And same with commercial.
look at the use charts.
Okay,
A
great.
lot of it's in there. For example, as I mentioned at the previous meeting, Belgrade already has townhouses in it.
Okay.
So the proposal there is to make the townhouse building type a permitted use in that suburb.
Great. Just wanted to confirm that.
They're not all the same.
Great, thank you.
Ma'am?
I'd like to go back to the lot compatibility zone, because it seems to me that if you, like I do, have a house that's close to the street, and 60 feet is actually, like, from what I saw in the picture, essentially my entire house, which means that I need to then have like a lot of space in the back to be able to do any additions, and for what what we have planned, seems like it would basically be impossible to do. So even though you say we're gonna permit second-story additions and all that stuff, not on my house if it.
No, they actually could go in that zone. The additions could go in that zone.
How?
They would just,
They would
they
just
would just have to
regulate
be
it.
compatible.
They would have to be
style.
compatible in terms of
But they have to have
design.
the eaves and all this other stuff, right? I mean, that's
That's
really,
the
really
proposal.
restrictive. But if you already have a huge house that has a huge setback, you're basically saying that person can do whatever they want with their house, and I don't think that that's
Well, actually,
fair.
all of the houses,
Like, I think it could be like a percent of the footage of your house or something.
yeah, and so I want to point another thing out because I wasn't aware of that. I was thinking that we could actually make it less for lots under 125, and you are probably one of the lots under
Like, I can show
125.
you which one mine is.
Yeah,
but-
'cause there were a
All the houses
couple.
on our block are-
And again, the 60 feet does become onerous, so but the 60 feet works for 95% of the lots in the neighborhood.
So what are you gonna do about
Again, that's what this is, the 1/2.
the 1/2?
You could, and maybe 1/2 isn't the right number.
1/2 of the lot.
It's the lot depth. So if your lot
That
is,
still could be most of the house.
Exactly, so maybe 1/2 isn't the right number. It
So are we
could be,
gonna discuss that?
it could be a third, it could be a quarter. I would love to know what
Like, I would
your
love to go
house
back
is, and
and
talk to me
like-
about it after,
Okay,
to look at that.
yeah, like this really freaked me out.
Yeah, no, because, I mean, it is, it's,
Idea
Like, you can make it, you can do
consideration.
it, fine, your house.
it's hard to have a one-size-fits-all, but in zoning, which this really is, you have to have a one-size.
I mean, it's possible
More
that my
standard start.
part of the
Standard.
residential core really isn't the residential core, and it shouldn't really be in that.
Where's your house?
It's, on Blue Ridge right here, but where there are only 3 houses, and there's nothing across the street.
Oh, okay.
It's like the, on the right side.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, no, further down. No, all the way to the right,
Your
All the
Seminole
way on the
Moreland.
Oh, over here.
right there.
These.
right there, those 3 houses.
Yeah, you're right. See, it does, it picks up the majority of the house.
And there's nothing across the street to compare to.
And you have really small lots there
Yeah.
too, super tiny. So how deep is your lot?
I don't know.
It looks like it's probably like 80 feet,
I
so
don't know. I don't know.
1/2 would be, could be 30, could be 40, depending.
Could be a different number.
Could be a different number, yeah. Sir, you were next?
Sure, so on the multifamily units, or I guess we're calling them multifamily because there are multiple dwelling units. What defines a dwelling unit? Does that
Under-
mean as a kitchen?
Under city and international law, a dwelling unit is a place that provides habitat, eating, sleeping, and shelter, which means
In the city of Atlanta, that means you have to have cooking facilities.
cooking facilities.
So if you built a garage apartment without a kitchen, that wouldn't be,
You can do that
You can
today.
do that today.
okay,
Yep, it really is a stove.
okay,
Hot plate, you can do it, and it's not a kitchen. Stove, it is a kitchen.
okay.
You may, and then we'll go to you.
I think going back to the 3 dwelling unit thing, I think there probably was some confusion about the question. I think, another way I answered it was thinking in terms of, well, I'd like to have a mother-in-law suite in my house, but what if I decided I wanted an ADU? And so, but I wouldn't want 3 units in a house or something that looked like a house, partly because we've been in the neighborhood when there was a lot of that.
Yeah.
And it was also pressure during the post-war era to provide housing for the soldiers coming back, the widows who lived here and had jobs. I mean, there needed to be housing in the city. And so they encouraged people to do boarding houses, which were then converted into apartments.
So
We have
again,
some of that in our neighborhood now, and I'd hate to see us go backwards because then you get a lot of rental and non-homeowner, non-residential homeowners.
Okay.
So I think it needs to be more.
next, who had their hand up next? I haven't done anyone on this side. Man, you in the back?
Sure, well, I would just like to speak to that last comment because I was one of the people who did support that in the survey and I was clear on it. I think that what we have learned over the last several years especially is that we are actually facing that kind of pressure for growth. And if we allow multifamily units like this, it's one of the best ways to preserve character while promoting density. Personally, I don't see anything wrong with having more renters. I think that's kind of inevitable anyway. I think those people are part of the fabric of our community, and a lot of them have been driven out with a lot of new people coming in. If we have more units, then there'll be fewer people who are displaced. And there'll be more places for people who are moving into the area to live that's actually careful. So that's why I just wanted to say this.
I can also speak to Bon Tom. We collectively decided as neighbors that we wanted to allow backyard bungalows and ADUs that were a bit more flexible than the city zoning. And part of that was so that if you're living in your home and you're retired, you want to stay there and your taxes are going up, then you can build a backyard bungalow and then you can rent out the front if you want your kids to move in. So it gives more opportunity to the homeowners as well to stay in their homes and be secure.
Sorry about
Right. Hey, I didn't hear you mention anything on the stacked flats like we talked about the last time, the missing middles. Did I miss that or?
And there are no changes from previous.
Okay.
So basically what that means, if you have a property that's zoned multifamily today or used as multifamily,
Right.
it can continue.
Okay. What about you mentioned something about stacked flats on potentially new construction last time and the missing middle? But sort of, I guess, bigger multifamily than what you've got listed there?
In talking about in the 1, 2, and 6 or another sub-areas? Or both?
Yeah, 1, 2, and 6, I believe.
Yes, and the way I
Existing
worded it in the draft, when you look at it, it
Okay.
says that if a property has a legal non-conforming multifamily use,
Right.
which means that you're not operating without a permit, you can continue to have that use on that lot of record in perpetuity, and would be subject to all of the form standards that otherwise apply. So if you're not building out to your capacity, the same capacity that a single-family home would have in that, for example, you can add the units if you wanted, but the form standards of the lot coverage, of the height, of the setbacks, of the massing, those are not going to change. Those are not going to change.
About,
You-
about lot coverage with these multi-units. Are we changing the lot coverage to 50%?
No, I propose keeping it as is. Now, the only thing that's different,
Explain my quick-
so, yeah, sorry, we're getting into zoning nerd language. No offense. So lot coverage under city code is basically the portion of a property covered by a building, parking, walkways, patios, porches, etc. We have not proposed to change that number, because that number impacts a lot of things. It impacts trees, it impacts greenery, it impacts sort of the character of the neighborhood. Now, with that said, there were a couple of provisions in Bonaventure Somerset that when you read the code, I thought were really great ideas. And I am recommending neighborhood-wide. And one of those is that in Bonsam, it says if you have a pervious surface, it doesn't count. That is consistent with what the stormwater law says, but the stormwater law conflicts with what the zoning says. So in most jurisdictions, if we weren't in Atlanta and we were rewriting the entire code over, we make them the same thing. But in Atlanta, you're actually more strict under zoning than you are under stormwater. So we equalize the two.
To pervious versus impervious.
Yes, to create an incentive that if you use pervious surface, meaning gravel or water can go through it, it doesn't count towards your lot coverage.
Good. Yeah, that's reasonable.
I think you, ma'am, and then you?
You had mentioned that your recommendation was to keep the chimneys. What happens if someone is doing an allowable second-story addition that then
Good question.
covers the chimney?
Yeah, I think probably in our current districts, we don't have a lot of experience with that, frankly, because we don't, in most districts, second-story additions are pretty tough nut to crack. So that's something we should probably think about if that is sort of assumed by second-story addition. The gable and dormer style additions, you probably would still be having that feature on the roof because the way you create a dormer gable addition is sort of within that form. But that's a great question about the chimneys in the second-story addition. I don't think we've quite thought about all that.
Dick, and then- oh, actually, no, you were next. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
ma'am.
That's a follow-up.
So, going back to the redwelling, is there a way to re-clarify the question so that for those that might have had confusion, number one? Number two, is there a way to take that redwelling and put it only in specific zones? I'll speak for myself. I was a renter most of my life, but once I purchased a home, which this neighborhood is one of the first places I decided to purchase a home, one of the reasons was because of the feel of the neighborhood and to think that every home beside me could be a three-dwelling home and not, isn't necessarily appealing to me as a homeowner.
We should dig into that in the survey for sure, but is the concern both the use and the form, as in like how it's arranged, or just the use no matter how it's arranged probably? Like there's earlier point here about like, well, maybe it would be okay if they were in a separate building, that would be the true ADU, but accessory dwelling unit, for example. Or that maybe doesn't help in your situation.
Is it that you don't want 3 different groups of people living on one lot?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, number one, there's a parking issue. I mean, obviously, a lot of times if you're going to have a three dwelling home, there's not a lot of parking and there's never enough room, and so you've got like overflow. Number two is, there's just a feel of it being residential homes all around you, and that's what you invested in, and that's, not to say, like I said, I've rented the majority of my life. I'm not necessarily knocking renting, but when you make that decision, there's a difference of someone that's coming in investing in a home, and then all of a sudden, the home beside you or across the street can be redeveloped into a three dwelling, at any point is concerning to invest in that property. So
Yeah.
I think that everybody needs to think about what are we really looking for? Because if I knew that was a possibility, if I knew that going into it, I would not have bought the home that I've purchased.
No, I think these are really good points. So we don't have a survey for you ready tonight, because last time folks commented that the survey wasn't as well thought out based on the comments. So we're actually, we'll be working with Amir to ask this kind of question very specifically. And I think the best way to frame it is to have varying sort of scenarios. I do point out that today, every single family home can have an accessory unit. So you're already at 2. If we wanted to go to 3, there are a bunch of ways it could be worded. You do need to treat everyone within a sub-area the same, or we get into equal protection under the law issues. So there are a bunch of scenarios, and I think it would probably make most sense for us to just sort of throw out scenarios for feedback.
And I would note just real quickly about the number of units thing, is we're talking, this conversation's been about, 1, 2, or 3 units, which is pretty distinct from a true multifamily building, which both in form would be more units, but also would be, if you look at the typologies that are in the draft, and when we put it out on the web or however we get it out to folks, see there's also the building form question, which I think goes to the comments over here, which is you have sort of the look of the arrangement plus what's inside it. But I do want to make a point that Caleb, I don't believe is recommending that there be true multifamily in any of the core areas. We're just talking about this issue of ADUs and maybe 1 or 2 more units, but definitely there's mixed feelings about it for sure.
Yeah, those are not
not allowed now, but yes, they're,
Back to the boundary thing, you had made some recommendations last time that part of what was included in 6 on the south side of North Avenue would be,
Yep.
have you made those changes?
I sent that to Doug's staff person yesterday, and did he update the map? Was he able to?
The graphically we didn't update it because of the layers, but I think we support the recommendations that came up last time for the sub-area changes.
This is the old map.
It's just a
yeah.
reference map to
Well,
have.
what about that set of residential houses that look like they're not in 6, but maybe they were wrapped into 5, right up there on North Avenue?
These are now in 2. This is the old map. So these are now in 2. And Copenhagen is now in 5. Copenhagen Lofts.
Very southern.
Yeah, Copenhagen is down here. And when you look at the code, you'll see why that is, because these sub-areas are basically zoning districts. And in order to put something as tall and dense as Copenhagen in the same sub-area as Belgrade, it's really hard to do under the same zoning district because they're so different in form. As for all these others are more or less compatible.
One thing I'd add that just about example sub-area 4 and 5, and like some of the street mostly 4 and 5 is one of the things that we probably should focus on a question somehow is how to accommodate, because as you know from your own experience and just looking at the map, those have pretty large lots and often have smaller buildings on a larger lot. So how do those buildings get treated? Because there's a lot of potential there to have good creative design solutions that, just an example, if you look at, sub-area 5, you'll see that there's several lots that look really big that have these big gray blobs on them. But in fact, that one of those is New Realm Brewery, for example. And that's really only one part of that lot. And then the white space of where the actual 5, the number 5 is partly the post office property and partly sort of what's north of the brewery, which is sort of, I guess, a more open parking lot. And, when we talk about questions about what really should happen with that corridor / sort of zone, and some degree with 4 as well, which is how do what are you looking at for the final character of those areas? Is that equally as important to be sort of a historic look or even the same scale that you have today? So is there a real extensive accommodation for additions to those buildings that really could support what could have been, what's allowed today, for example, but then might have a sort of different architectural twist to it just to make it fit in with that character, but at the same time allow, really the current size potential, if you will, of minority existence. So that's something we should make a note of, that really, I think, get down to that a little bit, get some more feedback on that, because it's a little more of a different conversation than about additions to homes and things like that.
One more, or then Dick, and then we'll.
You mentioned that you have roughly 50 pages of draft code for us to go through. And you also mentioned that you are organizing it better than what the city code is so that it actually makes sense.
A little bit.
I appreciate the
Within the parameters that we can.
True. My question is that going to be obvious which parts are legal now, exist, and we can or can't change them?
No, unfortunately, you have to know, it's all new content. I would say, I do have a printed copy here. Okay, so here it is. First section title and purpose. Every district has that, don't worry about it. Scope of regulations, all historic districts have to have that. Don't worry about it. Boundaries, definitions. When we get into the sub-areas, that's content. That's all new content. When we get into permitted uses, that is all new content. Really everything after the first 5 pages is all new content for Ponce Island.
But some of that includes what's already required by city code that we can't actually change. Is that true?
Not really, no.
No?
No. It's all new that I.
Maybe we might be able to do this is it might be we could add a sort of a coding that would say what's more, not that it's not flexible, but it's more that it's a standard component of a district. Like we have something, if you have a district, these are the topics we usually need to cover.
I was just thinking, maybe it's color coded or something. If it's in blue, don't worry about this because you're going to get it anyway. If it's in red, you can discuss it. If it's in
The only thing, again, that, with all due respect to Doug, that this has, that a zoning district does not have, a general City of Atlanta zoning district, is all the preservation and design stuff at the front, okay? And all the form stuff, the form-based things. Everything else, sidewalk requirements, access requirements, glass requirements, parking requirements, that's all in every other zoning district.
So maybe what we could do, just sort of trying to, because I think there's a good solution here that can help folks, is maybe we could spend a little bit of time and figure out the topics that are covered typically, so at least you know that that's sort of the universe we're working in. But I think what Caleb's saying is that within a given topic, the question is how can we both have things that relate to a historic district and reflect the priorities of the neighborhood. And that's where the content word he's using is like, so within this topic there might be a couple different approaches that are either that are based on neighborhood feedback, but still fall within the parameters of what we do in historic districts in the city of Atlanta. Because we now do a fair amount of activities in the historic district because they all are related to historic character, all related to defining how new buildings fit in with historic character, how they contribute to reinforcing that historic look and feel. And at the same time, not trying to mimic falsely historic buildings, because in many of our historic districts, having contemporary but compatible infills is an accepted practice, and we've been doing it for some time now. So that's what we can probably, either sort of coding or maybe like a sort of preface that sort of has some commentary that might help with your concern. I think that sounds like.
Okay.
One clarification, there are things that you brought up tonight in this presentation that may elicit some commentary. What I've heard is that one thing we're responding to, the other is the draft code, and the third is a survey. Is that correct?
The survey and the commentary are the same.
They are.
The survey will be about these
questions.
Yeah. So what we're going to try to do is get the survey up by the weekend and give folks about a week to take it.
Good.
But But again, we heard you loud and clear that it could have been a bit more organized last time, so we're going to make sure everyone agrees to what the questions are before we go live. So expect it on probably sometime on the weekend. Is that what you're still thinking?
Yes.
Yes.
So the other thing was a follow-up about chimneys. So if someone is rearranging their interior spaces and a chimney or a fireplace needs to move, they still want to have a fireplace. Would that go before the AUDC or the Department of Design to approve or not approve, or will it just not be prohibited, or will it not be allowed at all?
Yeah, so that goes to the question of the scope of the requirements, and that would be the same question that could be asked of windows, doors, sides,
Yes,
whatever.
exactly.
So, you know, the question is, retaining the historic character of a presumably historic building, to what extent does that reflect the priorities of the neighborhood?
What are the neighborhood?
The priorities of the neighborhood. So, you know, we already talked about this idea of you having areas that get more focus as far as architectural requirements and less focus in other areas, you know, front to back, whatever that ends up potentially being. So this is one of the questions, maybe this would be one of the things we make sure we have is how do we deal with this topic of chimneys in particular, as far as roof kind of features. You know, there's other things that stick out of roofs, as you all of course well know, but chimneys, which most people think of as being brick things, or at minimum stucco things, are what most conversations started. But you know, we don't typically have any requirements in our districts now that have much more expansive design requirements to deal with utility, flues, and stuff. That's all whatever needs to happen with that.
Direct heat conditions.
Can't regulate those.
I think it was a question in the back was the next one.
Sir?
Just curious, you said there was about 350 surveys filled out. Do you remember how many unique respondents there were?
170. Next. Yeah.
Hey, could you kind of speak again to what requirement would be if somebody wants to demolish their house to rebuild something new?
Sure. This is maybe to the gentleman's point over here. The city of Atlanta has demolition criteria that we do apply citywide in all of our historic and landmark districts. And there's two arguments you can make to demolish a historic building in a historic or landmark district. One requirement is that it is a threat to public health and safety. This is all defined pretty extensively in the code, in the current code that applies to all the districts. And the other is that it has to be unable to earn a reasonable economic return in its current state or in a renovated state. So what you're doing in that situation is comparing the cost to achieve potentially the goal you're talking about, and at the same time figuring out is there still economic use with what you have today. So you know, and that's just the request to demolish a historic building. Now, non-historic buildings don't have that criteria applied to them.
So, if I understood you correctly on part B of that answer, if it's prohibitively expensive to change the existing structure to try to accomplish what you want to accomplish, then demolition might be okay?
It's more, the code asks folks to show that there's not a reasonable economic return to the property now or in the proposed state. So the city code contemplates that if you have a reasonable economic return with your current situation or in a renovated state of your current situation or added to your current situation, that gives you economic return to the property. And so you're not necessarily comparing a house to a potential apartment building, you're comparing the fact that do both of those have potential economic return. And we ask, for example, not to get too much in the weeds, you know, third-party cost figures about what it takes to do these different scenarios, and then what kind of resulting value does that generate for a property. So it could be, for example, if you have a house, it would take 2 extensive renovations to put it back into service, let's say it was vacant or unused or whatever, and the money you spend doesn't result in a positive value, that's an unreasonable economic return for a house scenario. And then that is then juxtaposed potentially against the same question of cost versus value for what might be in the scenario you contemplated. But they're not necessarily one or the other. The question is there economic value in any of the alternatives on the property that might include what you asked to be done? And there's a very detailed description of the kind of information we need to make that assessment. Keep in mind that that's still subject to the public input process for folks. That still goes to some sort of a hearing with their design commission. And there's even a process that we set up that's very specific to those requests. So that it's as you imagine, it's one of the most consequential decisions that can be made about a historic building. And so it's pretty laid out the steps we have to go through to make that, allow that to happen.
Is that commercial too?
It applies to any historic building, including nonprofit institutional buildings as well.
Can you guys comment on, I know everybody's here, but mainly residential, but the commercial recommendation as well? Can you comment on some of the commercial?
Yeah, so
recommendations?
basically, as noted, commercials are sub-areas 3, 4, and 5. The recommendation is that if it is a contributing historic commercial building, that they would have to make compatible repairs and alterations to it. So, you couldn't board up windows or, completely remove historic brick and put foam or anything like that. As written, as Doug mentioned, I have recommended, based on everyone's feedback, a more generous approach to new construction. So you could add a very contemporary addition to the top or to the rear, or actually around the property as well.
I think Howard came late, the sweet Auburn in the corner. He just
okay.
asked the question.
Okay.
Could you show him the slide that just shows the
There's
additional?
some commercial slides there. This is one of the things I'll note while Cable's finding that, or even Athens found it, is we have a lot, when I say we, I'm talking about the Office of Design Preservation staff and even in our current districts, a fair amount of, more of the examples than you might have suspect on additions of the tops of commercial buildings, because it's a pretty common idea that comes up. So in the King District, for example, there's similar buildings that are on Highland Avenue in this neighborhood, also in Castleberry Hill, has a lot of the same sort of typology and types of buildings there. So that's one of the things that's actually is a pretty interesting sort of field of design thought, which is how do you make those all work and get what could be actually even pretty big addition to an existing building that still would fit in and all that.
Sir?
Yeah. I had a follow-up question on the demolition.
Oh, yeah.
Does the demolition prohibition apply to carriage houses?
Yeah, so in the districts we have now in the city of Atlanta, what are accessory buildings is really what a carriage house is. It's not the main building. That does not apply to those buildings, and we didn't really contemplate it applying now because they're not a key part of the historic character of the neighborhood. We have one neighborhood where that is not the case, but that's a neighborhood where those are actually architecturally designed accessory structures, and we're not suggesting that to be the case here. And that would apply to garage, any of the things that could be in your yard, for example.
We'll go this way now.
So back to the commercial real estate stuff, maybe we missed it or I missed it, but any recommendations as far as the heights? I know we discussed.
That's all in the, there's no change from previous, so that is in the code. I think for Highland, what it was 3-story at the street and then go back up to, I want to say 4 on the east and 6 on the west. And then on Ponce is what we talked about before, and then it's higher in the belt line. So it's all in the code right at the beginning under
This
the.
is part of the previous presentation.
Yeah, it was part of the previous
So
presentation.
what we're talking right now are
Yeah, nothing
changes to that.
Yeah, so it's sort of an iterative process, but yeah, this is where you get back to the point of the gentleman's question back of the idea of in some ways, ironically, commercial buildings have there's different design solutions because of the way they're currently shaped, and they have usually flat roofs. You have more options to get interesting solutions to those kind of questions.
I just wanted to know if the survey was going to tease apart some of the nuances about additions to non-contributing houses or maybe renovations that they, that we would have choices to say, yeah, we want it to look like it has always, or we want it to look more like the historic, I think we need a question on that. And also, what I'm really concerned about is your recommendation that contemporary could replace something that's torn down. And I am opposed to that. So I'd like to at least have a question that really states it in that way. If the house is demolished but it's historic or non-contributing, what do you want to see replaced there? Something that's compatible or?
Yeah. And I would, that's a great great way of thinking about it, is to Caleb's point, is that, you know, for better or for worse, there's actually just a tiny handful of currently existing vacant lots. And I'm discounting the parking lots on the commercial corridor, I'm just thinking about like sort of residential vacant lots. And you'll probably know, I'm sure you know better than I, but I can't think of one off the top of my head where it's already a vacant, essentially house lot. But that's the point well taken about a catastrophe or, you know, what have you, or even just an improved demolition for that matter.
Right, I mean, we have one on Linwood already that was supposedly approved because it was not structurally sound. And maybe
A
it's
demolition you're
because-
talking about, yeah.
Yeah, and maybe it's because we didn't have these things in place, but
That's correct.
just given those scenarios,
Sure.
you know, do you want to see
Yeah.
this, you know, block, you
Yeah.
think next to your historic house?
Well, the appropriateness is key, and how you codify that is beyond me.
Right, but a capital survey will just get
Well, I-
written down so evil.
Yeah, this is a question that does, has come up in the past, and so it's, there's a sense, and to your point, it sounds like, is that there's a different sense of sort of how you got to the vacant lot, maybe, of what you would be putting back, whether it already existed as a vacant lot, whether it's, you know, sort of circumstance that got there. And we'll certainly, I think, be able to think of a survey question. That's going to be a really great question for us to consider as far as process and city authority regarding that regard, but it'd be great to know the commentary, then we can figure out whether if there's a solution out there to deal with it.
We're going this way, you ma'am, and then you sir, and then we'll around that.
Can you speak to the next steps? I think our next meeting is supposed to be on the 20th. So you had said a survey would be coming out by this weekend, and we have a week for that. Can you just kind of walk us through the next several?
Yeah, we'll let Doug close up.
Okay.
Backing up to the zoning issue, just for clarification, I mean, I probably don't understand the codes, but right now we have R4, which I thought was single family, and R5, which is multiple family.
Allows duplexes only.
The R5.
Only allows duplexes.
And most of our residential areas are already under one of those two codes,
Yes.
correct?
Yep.
So what we're discussing by allowing multiple family around, to somebody else's point, we're talking about changing that so that everything would be R5 or 6?
There is
or-
no, they don't exist. It's completely tailored to this process.
Okay, so we're
There
talking
there
about
is no
creating
more
a new
R5
code.
or R4 zone.
But it would be this is the point of Caleb's point about something being an important thing to think about is it would be a different view of how the neighborhood would be I don't know, structured. It's not like a great sort of bureaucratic word, but it would allow things that aren't currently allowed now.
Right, so we're talking about creating a new code that doesn't
Correct.
exist. Correct. Yeah.
Which we're doing, proposing to do for the whole thing. And yeah.
Okay.
And then at the back, yeah?
What happens if we all come to a crossroad on a specific subject? How do we resolve that? Like, how does this get resolved?
Jerry? We want to come to impasse.
50-50.
You're saying in terms of how to vote, in terms of what happens then?
Yeah.
No one's answered that question yet. I don't have an answer as I stand here today. It's a question we should all ask ourselves about, you know, a democratic process. What is the fair solution to go do? I don't know that right now as we're speaking about it. You know, we're collecting data. We're giving that data to Doug and to Caleb directly. They actually they see the stuff. I don't think it's happened yet where it's been like exactly 50-50. I think there's been, you know, the data has allowed him to suggest this is what the majority of the people have expressed that they want. I think, you know, at the end of the day, if there are specific things that anyone is concerned about, you should email them, you should tell us about what they are, and we can present those questions to everyone to get clarification. The goal is to not create any confusion. The goal is to make sure that everything is truly addressed at the most granular level. I'll ask as many questions as you guys want us to ask. So we hope that that doesn't happen, that there's nothing at the end of the day that people feel like the question was never asked or never asked in a clear way, that there's not a clear answer in terms of what people want.
When you say email them, you're talking about Doug and
You can email
Caleb?
me, not Doug. I don't want you to email Doug and Kay. I want you to email us. All that information comes to them. I want them to be inundated with it directly.
Yeah.
Be able to email Caleb.
I would prefer if we could set up with the online survey. It's just easier for me to keep track of. So one of the things that I wanted to do, right, is have the survey based on this, based on everything we talked about. Also give an opportunity for y'all to review the code and open-ended, absolutely open-ended comment on that. And I think we can probably set that up in such a way that you go to the neighborhood, you go to the website, there's click here for specific, there's click here for open-ended.
Yep.
And I think that's the best way. Because I don't want to be getting 45 emails, I'm liable to butt them even or something. Which does happen.
But do I understand, this train, it's happening no matter what? Like, at some point, this is going to happen, and these are the rules one way or the other.
This is what's happening is we're aggregating the information to express preferences, right? Those preferences then are interpreted by Caleb. Then they actually have to go by the city. The city has to say, can you do that or not, no matter what, right? It has to fit within certain parameters you've got to follow through. Then on the 18th, the community votes on it. On the 18th of March, the community votes whether they want that or don't want it. And that's
As a proposal.
as a proposal, right? And then there's a
And
whole.
how do we vote? Show up at a meeting, a
There'll be a
survey?
neighborhood meeting, yes.
So the only people that vote are the people that show up?
No, we'll have absentee votes. It'll follow the same process that any zoning follows going through the MPU process. So we'll have a vote at the neighborhood level, and Ponce Highlands bylaws allow absentee votes for that. So we'll have a ballot that's approved and checked and all of that. And then that vote is taken to the MPU meeting where there's another vote, MP votes. And then that vote is taken to the ZRB, which is a public hearing that people can show up for too. Nobody votes there. The zoning review board is what that is, ZRB. They have a vote. And then it goes from there to the city council zoning committee, and then they vote, and then the city council, and then the mayor signs it. Or doesn't.
Very long.
So each of these pieces of consensus are recommendations.
Yeah.
We are voting to recommend something. It's not 30 people vote this way, 29 people vote this way, and that's the done deal. That's not how zoning works.
So what you have is, Amir Faroqi was here at the last meeting, and he basically stated, whatever we want, whatever the community votes for, he's gonna support and vote for that. That's still, the rest of the city council has to vote too. He's one vote in that process. The important thing, if I were to, I'm gonna interject my own view for a second, not about whether you should vote for or against it. When I tell everybody that's asked me, what do I think about it, I go, I think you should contribute whatever you want to it, no matter what, so that whatever happens, you got the most of what you wanted. Whether you're for or against it, I'm not gonna tell anybody what they should vote for. I would say that if you're for it, put as much in there as you really want. Express yourself so that your preference is known and that collectively it's known. Even if you're against it, put your preferences in there, so if it's adopted, then you go, I got most of my preferences in there. We're not gonna tell you what to do. That's up to you to decide what you wanna vote. That's what I think is the smart approach to it. That's my own opinion, okay? The second thing is that as it relates to people, and I said this before and I'm gonna repeat it one more time to make sure it's clear. If you feel like something's not been asked and you want it to be something that's surveyed amongst the community, it's relevant to this process and has to still pass by them, send us that. You can email that. We'll get that incorporated into a survey in some capacity, okay? It may not be this survey, but we'll get it incorporated in the survey. Our goal is to get everybody to have the opportunity to have their voice heard. So I want to say that and make sure that's right.
And I understand
Yes.
that even if this passes and goes into the code, it's not put in stone. There are tweaks that can be made in the future. And you sort of implement this and learn from the process of implementation. We can come back to this and say, this is working, this is not.
Yeah, if I say that there's one item, let's say the multifamily, 50-50 split, and I don't believe that there's something that I can ethically recommend because I'm subject to a professional code of ethics, I may just recommend we don't change that. That's a future conversation, we move forward with that.
Yep.
A lot of times when you write zoning, it's like politics, right? You have two extremes. You always have the folks who don't want to change anything or don't want any regs, and the folks who want more, and a lot of folks are somewhere in the middle. And if that's where the question becomes, is there more good than harm out of this? And if we need to make most folks feel that there's more good than harm out of it, we might need to take a couple things out. But the reality is, we are operating under zoning today. So if we did do that, we need to craft it because, as you know, Bonsam is R5, rest of the neighborhood is R4. You can actually do 3 units in Bonsam today. You can't in the rest of the neighborhood. So we'd have to tweak the code, but we could take stuff out. Sir?
Just a point of clarification, if the community vote fails, does the process continue to move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Department of City Planning would have a hard time supporting legislation that didn't have the support of the community.
Okay.
I think that would be a conversation now that I want to have with your council member as well, see if there's any thoughts that he has about that, but it would be pretty tough for us to move forward.
But it's possible to move forward, right?
But it is possible, but we have not gone to the zoning review board without neighborhood support for a proposal. That was a neighborhood project versus an individual.
How would that work procedurally?
Yeah, to Caleb's whispering right here about procedure, so what would have to happen is that we would have to note along the way that we don't recommend this go forward anymore. But to make perfectly clear, everybody, it will show up on agendas because we can't unilaterally remove it from the agenda until it gets to a certain part of the process. So, if we get to that scenario, I'm still optimistic we can find a path forward of some sort of consensus. To Caleb's point about, if that means reducing the scope or purview, because we can always amend it, which we have done now 4 or 5 times with other districts after they've experienced the pluses and minuses to that, or what they thought was a pretty good package, and they ended up thinking, this is not doing what we want to do. We actually want to have more requirements. That's usually what people do, is add more requirements in revisions, I would add. Which is not what people normally expect, but that's what's happened so far. You sort of get to that idea of the core values and how those can be expressed in a administrative, legal tool that we can actually do on behalf of the neighborhood and with the neighborhood. And that might mean some of the outliers, to Caleb's point, some of the outliers won't have to fall away if they're really sort of out of that core package, so to speak.
Thanks. Did I hear you say that majority of respondents wanted commercial use as a residential house?
That was actually...
And Chief, follow up, what would that mean?
The question was, should small mixed-use buildings be allowed in residential areas?
Is that the live work question?
It was worded as live work and mixed use, yeah.
Well, that's.
Yeah, and y'all can operate a home business out of your home everywhere. Legally, the city isn't going to regulate that. Home occupation is fine. But what makes it commercial is when you have people come and going. So even live work is technically commercial under city code because you have customers.
Well, if you have clients coming to meet.
Yeah, clients. Like if you run a home business, that's...
Like me. I don't come to my house.
Any other questions So I'm going to let Doug talk about the process. And then hopefully you filled out the counting parts along the way. So Doug?
So real quick, we've actually sort of touched on this a little bit already, but I'll just recap and sort of make sure everybody's on the same page. So we're, as described before, there's sort of a community process, which we're obviously still in the midst of generating ideas, trying to, generate consensus, priorities, what have you, to get a proposal that would come before the Neighborhood Association in March, which is what Gary discussed. As someone pointed out in the back, there's a series of city meetings that occur along the way. So we have one of our city meetings back in January, which was the Urban Design Commission public hearing. We're sort of in between the meetings, if you will, right now. And then later on in the process, the gentleman's question here is there's a series of meetings that will occur later on. And those include the Zoning Review Board meeting, which is a set of folks who are appointed by the Mayor and City Council to consider all rezoning requests in the city of Atlanta. They have always a full agenda of all sorts of questions. And then there's the various elected officials who have their part in that process. The key consideration for public conversation are, of course, all the community meetings, whatever form and shape, however many they are, they get organized in the Neighborhood Association. That's community conversation. The Zoning Review Board, which is a public hearing, regardless of what the Neighborhood Association recommendation might be as a body, having voted or whoever the leadership wants to do that, that is open to the public. Everybody can come to that meeting if they're for, against, or agnostic against the proposal, have some amount of time to speak, I can't remember what the time is, and then there's a, you know, some resident public hearing, so everyone can show up and do that. And then the legislative meetings that would follow after that, that were also referred to, the city council, zoning committee, and full council, they are open to the public, but there's not public commentary as part of like a public hearing style format. The process is, from the city perspective, has an end date in late May, when we need to have made a decision one way or the other to work. That's within the current process we have established starting November 25th.
Within the neighborhood or?
That's all the way to the end of the legislative cycle, correct. Yeah. Which is why if you think about the sort of timeline, and we did have a handout in our previous meetings that's still essentially the same, little chart thing. The March 18th meeting, which I think was the monthly meeting of the PHNA in March, that is before all the rest of these sort of city meetings. So that's the, we go back into the city meeting sort of thing. I think Gary's trying to maybe pull that up right away.
And as a point of clarification for what you said, this is a zoning matter.
This is a proposed rezoning by the city of Atlanta in partnership with the neighborhood association. And we have already filed placeholder legislation to do that, because that's the way we need to keep the process moving. But it by no means prescribes an outcome.
Alrighty, well, you're pointing to the calendar, I think. I do want to ask you one thing. You do have worksheets at your table, so if you would be so kind as to let me know anything you're thinking. Right now, while it's fresh in your mind, please fill those out, give them to me before you leave. And then you signed in, you will be getting notification about when that survey is online, and we're gonna try to make it much more user-friendly than before. And then there is a draft, but it sounds like we might want to color code it in some ways, or not?
I mean, we can give it to you in the draft form now, if you want to look at it, you know. We can try to dissect it a little bit ourselves. It might take a couple more days to do that, to help people understand, or sort of extract certain information from it to make it sort of a shorter version of information that we think are the things we talked about, the highlights, if you will. And maybe, Doug, maybe we can also, separate from that, to sort of just make a comment on it, and just give people like the verbiage of here's the next steps to go. So that we've got a timeline on it, we can actually explain what happened in each step. We can publish that so that we can kind of know.
We can take the chart and add some commentary.
And but again, I want to emphasize this is draft. That means draft. That means like, literally, this was given to us today before noon. Doug hasn't even had an opportunity to really put his eyes on it. So that's all got to be done.
My recommendation, not the zoning attorney, I think it's legal. City attorneys need to make sure. So.
The thing is you can go through it and make your notes. And if there's things that you're concerned about or things you want to comment on, it allows you to go do that, okay? And then we'll try to come up with some shorter versions of it. It'll take us a couple of days to do that. Yes.
So is the next meeting still February 20th?
It is still scheduled for the 20th.
And what should we expect for that meeting?
I don't know. But what I think
Is Caleb at that meeting?
I don't have that down. I don't even think I have down that day.
So I don't know. It was scheduled a long time ago as a date. We're focused right now on the next step is to get the survey out, get that information back, give that to him, because that's input that's got to be in there. We're also focused on your comments, that whatever else has not been missed, this is your chance to put it in there so that it gets addressed.